I'm gonna kind of review a little bit of stuff we did last time, and then get going on the new stuff for today, unless we have any questions or comments that you guys want to start with. Um, Something I thought of after last time, I was going to mention it, but I didn't. You may remember that I was going to go with Aristotle's kind of description of human mentality or consciousness as opposed to animals by saying that Aristotle said we had a desire to understand and animals didn't. They're curious, but only curious about, as far as we know, their immediate needs. They're not really curious about whether stars are like, whether all the sparkling stars in the sky are the same thing as our sun or not. They probably don't care about that, but we do because we're nutcases. Anyway, something that's more of a topical nature is that right now there's a lot of people talking about artificial intelligence becoming conscious. I don't think that's going to happen. And here's my two reasons. I don't know why more people don't say this, but one of them is Aristotle's reason. Artificial intelligence is not curious. If you tell it to look something up, it'll look it up, but it doesn't look it up because it's curious about it. It's not going to go online by itself and say, who won the World Series in 1953. It's not going to do that. You have to tell it to go look. So that it doesn't have any intrinsic curiosity. And even as I said last time, even a microbe is curious because it's looking at its environment, it's trying to see what's going on. But unless you tell a robot to be curious about its environment, it's not going to be. So that's one thing is I believe artificial intelligence lacks intrinsic curiosity. And the other thing is it doesn't care if it's alive. If you turn your computer off every night and it doesn't complain, and when you turn your computer back on in the morning, it isn't mad at you because you turned it off. It doesn't care whether it's on or not. I think those things are pretty essential for a living being that's conscious, that it cares about being alive, and it cares about, if you're human, you care about other things. Anyway, that's just my opinion. We're still at the early days of artificial intelligence. Now, I want to go over, just briefly review what we talked about last time, which was for a couple of 100,000 years, human beings were just hunky-dory without having science, without having philosophy. They were just telling myths to each other. And we called the myths that were explanatory etiological myths. And I mentioned a couple of examples of them. And then what I wanted to say was there was a set of beliefs in ancient Greece that I thought made it a fertile ground for philosophy to begin. And it does seem like philosophy kind of began in ancient Greece. And I know in this day and age, you're supposed to treat every culture as equal, but I don't. For one thing, many cultures didn't have any written language until they were colonized. One of the benefits of colonization, if we're gonna list benefits, is that Polynesian myths and Native American myths got actually recorded for the first time. And before that, they went on for thousands of years, and we don't know except orally what they said. So Greece did have a written language, as I mentioned, and then it crashed in the Bronze Age collapse and then started again around 800. And soon thereafter, philosophy began. And there was a couple of myths, themes to myths that I mentioned. One was the polytheism that I'm guessing that made kind of an ecumenical milieu where people could have different beliefs and yet they didn't hate each other and kill each other, whereas the monotheistic religions tend to be really mad if you don't believe what they believe, and the Greeks weren't like that. So that's one thing, the acceptance of important beliefs which were different from your own. I also mentioned that half of the Olympian gods, usually numbered at 12, were female. And we're going to come back to this. I cannot reconcile, I don't know how to reconcile the fact that females were excluded from the Greek democracy, you know, the lauded Greek democracy, which was the beginning of that form of government, did not include females. And yet their gods included females. I'm not sure how to reconcile those two. Maybe one of you has an idea of how to do that. However, when we get to Plato, you'll find out that Plato thinks that women would do just as well as guardians. The guardians were the leaders of the state, of the republic, if you read that. And so they were the ultimate rulers. And he doesn't see any reason why women couldn't also be the ultimate rulers. Whereas in the Athens of his day, only men were leaders and allowed to vote. So for the day, it was a pretty liberal view for Plato to take. We're going to get back to Republic. Also, another thing I mentioned is the emphasis on the here and now and a de-emphasis on the afterlife, which was very important to the Egyptians and also to Christians later. I also mentioned Moira. Moira is kind of fate, but it's also the order of the universe, the way things ought to be, the place of everything, the portion. If you look up Moira, it'll say place and portion as well as fate. And so it's not a temporal thing necessarily. It's also the right place for everything. And I mentioned that the right place for human, or the right portion for human, is a mortal life. And for gods, it's an immortal life. And how Odysseus yearned for his mortal life, even though he's being offered immortality. Also in Greece, and this kind of goes along with the ecumenical idea of different gods, there was no priestly class, no doctrine, no official doctrine, and no holy scripture. So certainly Homer was respected, but he wasn't considered an authority that you would refer to. Although we'll get to Plato and how he uses authorities like this in a very original way, which is it's very strange that Plato was so important and yet he hasn't been copied. Nobody else uses the structures that he does to compose philosophical works. Interesting that he wasn't copied. Now, before I get to actually plunging into the pre-Socratics, I wanted to ask you, does anybody have any interest in the Oracle at Delphi? Because I know something about that, but it isn't directly related to the development of philosophy, but yet it does constitute an important part of the milieu in which philosophy developed. So I can talk about that if you like.
We are interested.
Yes, definitely.
Oh, okay. Well, good then. Okay, well, the story on the origin of the Oracle at Delphi is that a shepherd was tending his flock in the neighborhood of Delphi. Delphi is a town on Mount Parnassus, and Mount Parnassus is a mountain on about the middle of the north side of the Gulf of Corinth. So it's northwest of Athens, Mount Parnassus. And the temple of Apollo at Delphi was located on that mountain, as was the temple of Dionysus, which is also a different but very interesting cult. So anyway, the legend is that a shepherd was tending his flock in this area. And all of a sudden, the sheep started to talk to him and talk to everybody, talk to each other. And so it became a kind of sacred area. Now, interestingly, about 20 years ago, Scientific American published an article where some geologists had gone to that area and discovered that there was evidence of a fissure that in ancient times may have been putting out ethylene. And ethylene is a gas that'll make you high. I think it's the gas that huffers use. If all you guys that are huffers out there, huffers are people that spray something into a bag and then suck it out of the bag and they get high. I've never had the pleasure of huffing myself, but apparently it's the same gas that was emitted from this fissure by normal geological processes in ancient times. Now, since that Scientific American article, you have to give, that's a fairly credible magazine. Since that article, some people have disputed that, as they will, scientists. That's their nature, to be disputatious. So we don't know that for a fact. But anyway, the process at the Oracle. The Oracle was around for about after this shepherd thing, and then they started to view it as a holy site. They built the temple of Apollo. Apollo is the god of prophecy and truth and light. And after they started this temple, it became quite a complex. There's a big theater there, an open, an amphitheater like the Greeks have, and a temple and several temples. And there's a treasury, I think, there, because what you did was people would travel from as far as Persia to come and visit the Oracle and have their fortune read, basically. And the idea was that there was a woman called a Pythia. The Pythia was a local woman that wasn't necessarily as far. Now, a little of this is shrouded in mystery because, like all the cults in Greece, they like to be shrouded in mystery. Let's just put it that way. And so our records are somewhat questionable, but nevertheless, the idea was the Pythia, who was a woman, would descend into a little chamber. And in that chamber, she'd go into a trance. And some of the art suggests that she would breathe something in to put her in this trance. And so that corresponds to the idea that, of the shepherd and the fisher emitting ethylene. So anyway, what you do is you go, if you have a question, you go to the complex and you would take a purifying bath and no doubt give them some money. And then you get to talk to the priest. You stand in line and finally you get to talk to the priest and ask him, does she love me? Does she not? Can I kill this guy in a contest? Whatever you want to. One of the famous ones was they asked about, the Greeks asked about the war with Sparta, and the answer was the wooden walls will protect you. And you talk to the priest and ask him your question. He would ask the Pythia, and the Pythia would descend into this chamber and then come back and say something that nobody could comprehend except the priest. And then the priest would give you an answer. And like most answers of this sort, it was generic enough so that you would make sense of it. If my own experience is, if you come to one of these augury systems like the I Ching or a tarot deck or anything like that, if you're really troubled by something, no matter what answer they give you, it will mean something to you. But if you go to the augury without any particular question and you ask them something, the answer may not have. I would compare it to listening to a country song, a sappy country song, and you think it's just sappy until you have a breakup. And then you listen to the song and you go, oh, that's exactly what I feel. And so I would compare that to how you feel with an augury, because there's a ritual with the I Ching, for example, or the tarot, or astrology, that makes you feel like whatever is being read to you is for you personally. And that ritual seemed like, there's a famous experiment by the amazing Randy about this, but anyway, I get distracted. I don't get distracted, but I'm gonna if I start that story. But anyway, if you go to the Pythia, I think, or the priest, And the priest tells you something, it's going to mean something to you if you have a question in your heart about it. Anyway, so that's what would happen. She would go down there and she'd say something incomprehensible to the priest. The priest would translate to you. And one of the famous ones was Charmides, who was a friend of Socrates, went to the oracle at Delphi and asked who was the smartest or the wisest person in all of Athens. And the Pythia answered, no one is wiser than Socrates. And so Charmides goes back and tells Socrates this. This is a story Socrates relates in the Apology. And Charmides tells Socrates this, and Socrates goes, nah, that's nuts. I don't know anything. I'm not wise. And then he goes, oh, maybe my wisdom, if I have any, is that I know I'm not wise. That's a famous response by Socrates. But anyway, that's one of the famous interactions with the oracle at Delphi. So Athens had a big, I think Athens had a big treasury there, and they were frequenters of the oracle. I have some pictures of it. We went there. I've been there twice. I went there once on our sailing voyage. When we got to Greece, I had to go to the oracle at Delphi again and ask the oracle if we were going to make it home alive. And as is typical, the oracle didn't give me any clear answer, but I guess we made it. Anyway, this milieu with augury, people who had mystical seers or oracles. The Delphic oracle wasn't the only oracle, but it was the biggest one, most important. It was around for like 700 years. I think it still existed in the Roman period, if I'm not mistaken. It was around for a long time, and it was really it was the most important of all the oracles, but there are other ones. Anyway, so this is, again, the milieu of mythology and oracles and reading entrails of birds or whatever. This is the milieu into which the philosophers were born and grew up in, and yet they turned a page, I think, in human consciousness. That's all I have to say about the oracle. I could say more about it, but what I think we do in this class is there's an old, outdated biological theory called that I love because it sounds so good, is ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. Does I see you nodding your head. So the idea is that the fertilized egg, as it matures to the animal that's going to be born, goes through every stage of evolution. So it starts out as a single cell, then it becomes a worm, then it may becomes a fish, then a salamander, then a mammal, and then is born. That was the idea. And I think that's what we do here in this class. I felt myself that in order to see, the question arises when you study philosophy, why are we studying all these old guys? Why don't you just tell us what we know? You know, the modern age obviously supersedes everything that went before, just like it does in technology or science. So why don't you just tell us what people think now? And the problem is, my experience anyway, is that in order to really understand how the human mind grew, you have to kind of go through all the same steps yourself and see why these decisions were made, why these questions were asked, when they were asked, and how they developed. I don't think that's a unique view, but it is my view of what we're doing and why we start so early with a bunch of nonsense. So anyway, so the pre-Socratics, these guys were not all from Athens. Athens was not yet the big main center of Greece. the first guys we study are the Milesians, which is Thales and his two students, Anaximander and Anaximenes. And they were interested in what the primordial stuff was, out of which everything else was made. And Thales thought everything was made out of water. They just tell you this in the book, like your book about ancient philosophy. He thought everything was, well, that is just the dumbest shit I've ever heard. And I just have to, Thales was known as this really smart guy, and for good reason. He was the first guy that we know of that actually attempted to prove geometric theorems. The Egyptians knew about the Pythagorean theorem because they knew about geometry. So did the Babylonians, so did the Chinese. That's how they built things. They knew, but they knew them like a carpenter knows them. For some reason, Thales got the idea of proving things. And one of the things he proved was that if you take a circle and divide it by a diameter, the sides will be the same in area. And that may seem obvious to you, but that's the kind of thing that in geometry class in high school, they would make you prove. But before the Greeks, even though people would know this stuff, they didn't see any reason to prove it. But the Greeks thought, we have to prove it. I'm not really sure why they thought they had to prove it, but they did. And then eventually Euclid compiled all these things, and his great work, he's not really, he's a compiler. He probably made some proofs himself, but also he collected all the proofs that are around. But anyway, the first ones we have a notion of are Thales, or those by Thales. And another thing Thales did, he was known as a really smart guy. And there was a saying during his day, just like you would say about Einstein, you would say about Thales, that some dude is really smart, he's a regular Thales. That was actually something that people would say about people. So Thales was a polymath, and one of the things he figured out, it seems obvious, I suppose, was how to measure the height of a pyramid. And all he did was, if you stand in the sun and you see your shadow, if you wait until the shadow is exactly the same length as you are tall, then that's an equilateral triangle. And if you measure the shadow of the pyramid, that'll tell you how tall the pyramid is. I mean, it's kind of clever. I don't know if it's genius, but another thing he did was figure out how to tell how far a ship was on the horizon using triangulation. And the interesting thing about that was we were using that same method until radar was invented. I myself had to learn it to be able to navigate. So if you know the height of a lighthouse light above sea level, if you know that, and that's posted in the piloting information, if you know that, you can by triangulation figure out how far away you are from the lighthouse. You measure the angle, and then you can figure it out. So Thales thought that up. He also did he supposedly predicted an eclipse. I think that's probably not true, but by legend, he predicted a solar eclipse. I don't think that's likely, but it just kind of shows you that he was kind of a legendary brainiac. And then another thing he did was predict that it was going to be a good year for olives, and he took a lease out on all the olive presses, and then he made a bunch of money, showing that philosophy wasn't just for nerds, it also could make you a rich guy. Anyway, the main thing he's known for is thinking that everything was made out of water. And I predict Brian, do you have your hand up?
Yep.
Oh, okay, well, go ahead. Just barge in. You don't have to, no formality here.
Well, not to sidetrack things, but my question was whether what you described about Thales seemed like someone just trying to understand the rules that governed the world around him. All of this mathematics, this kind of, you know, how do things work that I see. Was he at all interested in what questions we would think of as being philosophical, more about the role of man in the universe, or what our purpose is, or was he more of an engineer?
Well, good question. By the way, I should have mentioned that for all the pre-Socratics, until we get to Socrates, and Socrates didn't write anything, so everything we know about him was written by Plato. But all these pre-Socratics, and I'm going to go over Thales, mainly Thales, Parmenides, Heraclitus, and Pythagoras. We just have little bits and pieces, just fragments of what they wrote. And I compare it to an archaeological dig where you've got, you know, you're digging away and you find a little piece of broken pottery, and then you find another piece of broken pottery, and then you find a stone tool, and you find a couple of bones. And from that, you construct what that civilization was up to. That's about where we're at with the pre-Socratics. We don't know very much about them. And unfortunately, what this does is it's a hotbed for, you know, a Rorschach test, because people will just listen to, like, this is particularly true of Heraclitus, who we'll get to, but you know, you read this stuff about the opposites and about never stepping in the same river twice, and you start to extrapolate and make up your own myth about what he was up to and make it seem really heavy. There is a tendency for people to believe that at one point people were really wise, and we've lost that, and there's been sophisticated theories or people or civilizations that are lost in the midst of time. I'm not so fond of that theory. There's a theory in geology called uniformitarianism, and that is that things are happening in geology the same way now that they were happening 10 million years ago. I'm kind of that way about humans. I think humans were probably smart and dumb and greedy and generous and all the things they are now. I think they probably were that way 10,000 years ago. But I don't know if that answers your question. The short answer is no, we don't know what his politics were. Mainly he's known for these physical things. That he and the other Milesians, they call them Milesians because they're from Miletus. What was I going to say? Anyway, we just know bits and pieces of these guys. And the Thales, the thing I'm going to concentrate on is water. What he was doing, you know, I imagine this conversation he was having, and somebody was talking about what a wonderful world it was, and how the gods have created this beautiful situation for us. And Thales is thinking, and he says, you know, I think everything, like you and the mountains and your daughter and all the carts and houses and everything, I think it's all made out of water. And the guy says, are you out of your mind? Why would you say something so stupid? Because it's not like they didn't know it was stupid at the time. I had a guy one of my most memorable students was this kid that sat right in the front row all the time and paid very close attention to everything I said. He was a pretty good student, but the thing was, he always had a look on his face like, what? Always. And I thought, that is the perfect face for philosophy. Like, what? The RCA dog look, you know, what are you talking about? Because it seems strange to me that nobody emphasizes that. If you read a philosophy book, oh yeah, he thought it was, what are you talking about? He thought it was water. First of all, why would you even raise the question of what is everything made out of? You don't need to know that. Why would you think everything was made out of a certain thing anyway? what the hell? Why was he coming up with this? I'm going to try to present his possible reasoning, but we don't know. I call your attention to the shard hypothesis again. We don't know what he thought. But bear in mind that the question he asked, what is everything made of, eventually yielded the periodic table. So it's a question we still care about. We still want it. And the periodic table is still in the process of being developed, but it's pretty set right now for most everything that's normal matter. But yeah, we want to know, what is everything made out of? And the Milesians are interested in stuff. Whereas when we get to Parmenides, Heraclitus, and Pythagoras, they're going to be interested in the laws that cover the universe, that they're not so much the substance, but the structure. They're going to be interested more in that. But for the time being, let me explain what I think maybe Thales was thinking. First of all, water is the only substance on Earth that exists at normal temperatures in all three states of matter: a solid, a liquid, and a gas. Nothing else. You can freeze nitrogen and you can boil lead, I suppose, but at normal temperatures, there's nothing else that exists in all three states of matter. So that's one thing peculiar about water. Another thing about it is that if he thinks everything's ultimately made out of water. Well, if you imagine boiling water, what happens? It vaporizes and then it becomes invisible. So if absent any knowledge of what the atmosphere, we know it's nitrogen and oxygen mostly, but I didn't know that. And if you thought, well, okay, water boils and then at a certain point it becomes invisible and we breathe it, so maybe water becomes air. That's not that crazy of an idea. Maybe water is ultimately the source of all the air we breathe, because we can see if we boil it that it becomes air. It seems to become air. And then Earth, you would think there's no way that water can become Earth, but Thales would have been familiar with the flooding of the Nile every year. And when the Nile floods, and then it recedes, what happens? You have a bunch of mud there that wasn't there before. Where did that come from? It seems to have come out of the water. And in fact, this is the way that salt, the Bonneville salt flats are just, when salt water evaporates, it leaves this residue of salt, and the H2O is gone, but the salt is still there. And so I imagine that Thales thought something like that, like this is a residue. When water, in certain conditions, water will leave a residue of Earth. And then the last thing, if we go with the four elements that were typical of, Empedocles thought there were four elements: earth, water, air, and fire. And I think that was a common Greek belief. But how would fire be created from water? Well, we know that clouds produce rain, and so water comes out of the clouds. But what also comes out of the clouds is lightning. And lightning seems to have its source in water, if you look at it that way. So Thales, if he thought about all those things, would think, well, that's a lot of stuff to be originally water. Air and earth and fire could all come from water. Another consideration is that water is the most universal solvent. Everything dissolves in water eventually. So that would lead him to believe that everything returns to water. So it'll wear down rocks, and even oil will eventually dissolve in water. And finally, no, not finally, he's got two more. All life depends on water. And when we go to Mars and look to see if there's any evidence of life, what do we look for? We look to see if there's signs that there was water there. And that's what we find, that there was water there. And so we go, well, there could have been life. And so all life depends on water. And finally, Thales thought that the earth was surrounded by water. And that's not exactly wrong because 70% of the earth's surface is water. He didn't know that, of course, but he thought maybe all the land was surrounded by water. So for all those reasons, I want to try to defend Thales and say that it wasn't as crazy as it sounds to think that everything was made out of water. But actually, the most important thing about
Tony,
yes, yes,
just to add one more later argument, not
okay,
at the same time, if you read the creation story in the Bible, it starts with everything being water and God separating the waters and creating earth.
very good. Right now, of course, Thales is unlikely to have known that or had that reference. And as a matter of fact, we're going to run into some other interesting parallels between the Greeks and other religions, and I'll get to that. But bear in mind that the religious texts, like the Ramayana and the Old Testament, New Testament, the Vedas, the Quran, these are mostly stories and or prayers and or rituals. And even when they talked about science, it would be embedded in a story or a prayer or a ritual. Whereas Thales and the pre-Socratics now are going to be completely divorced from any ritual context or mythological context. They're not going to discuss that, which is, I really believe, a turning point and a threshold that we have. I mean, to be fair, there are people today that think science is wrong and their myth is correct, right? I mean, this is something we are confronting right now in the United States, that there are people who don't believe science and they're more comfortable believing something that's a story that to us doesn't seem empirically valid. But so that's still going on today. People get very attached to these myths, and the pre-Socratics, to give them credit, were not. They were going to say, well, what can we figure out with our brains, just using our eyes and trying to figure out what's the most sensible explanation for what we're seeing. Okay, so what I wanted to say about the next thing that's very important is Anaximander and Anaximenes, who were his students, disagreed with Thales, but they didn't disagree because he was opposing tradition or anything like that. They didn't say, "Hey, that's not what the elders say. That's not what our myths say." They didn't disagree on that. They disagreed on the merits. They said that explanation is not going to work because this and this, and they gave what would be called scientific reasons why it wasn't working. And so another significant thing I think I mentioned last time is that from the get-go in philosophy, the master is not accorded any special reverence. The master is not seen as being a voice of God. So if you compare that to the Old Testament prophets or Jesus or Buddha, where the acolytes, the followers of the master, will quote In fact, here's a funny story. Bertrand Russell, well, just let me finish my thought. The master is not criticized. You don't say, "Nah, I don't think that makes sense, Buddha," or "I don't think that makes sense, Jesus." That's not how they're responded to. Their followers consider them, and same with Muhammad. Their followers consider them oracles or the voice of God, essentially. Moses, same thing. So I was just going to tell you a funny story about Bertrand Russell, who's famous, important British philosopher in the 20th century, was a progressive and a leftist and his whole life. And one time he interviewed Lenin, and he was shocked that when he was trying to discuss all these different matters with Lenin, and Lenin would just quote Marx to him. as though that was the end of it. Just like a Christian would quote the Bible. Well, you say that, but in Genesis, da da da, it says this. That's the way Lenin thought. He said, well, the answer to that is found in the Communist Manifesto, book 3 or chapter 3. And Bertrand Russell was appalled, basically. He went, what? This is not a religious text, dude. Anyway, so even today, there are people that will quote the Bible and consider it the final, or the Quran, or whatever the religion is, and consider it the final answer, the final authority. That is not the case with philosophy. The first thing your students do is criticize your point of view. And I think I mentioned last time that the classic example is Aristotle, after studying with Plato for 20 years, disagreed with him, and he said, dear is Plato, but dearer still is the truth. That's pretty heavy duty when you got two of the big giants of classical philosophy, and they don't agree. And yet, great respect to Plato, but I'm sorry, the truth is more important. I'm not sure I want to continue. I don't want to bore everybody to death. I've already been going for 45 minutes. We are still going to discuss Parmenides, Heraclitus, and Pythagoras. And I think I might leave that for next time. But I want to emphasize again that the Milesians, and that's who we were just talking about, are interested in what the ultimate stuff was. And the Parmenides, Heraclitus, and Pythagoras are going to be interested in what kind of the laws of the universe are, more like that, the structure of things. And we'll talk about that next time, I think. Unless anybody has any questions, or I welcome any questions or comments or insults or rebuttals, whatever you got.
Wanted to say about Thales, he would not have known Genesis,
No.
but he probably would have known the Babylonian creation myth in which Tiamat, the dragon of the waters, is slain and the world and human beings are made from her body. And he might well have known the Egyptian Genesis in which the life-giving fresh waters are the source of everything. So obviously he wouldn't have taken that as authoritative, but it could have well have been suggestive to him.
It's really impossible to know, but you're right. I mean, as I said, they grew up, all these guys that we're going to be talking about, the pre-Socratics, grew up in a mythological context. Whether Thales got around, he was in he lived in Miletus, and Miletus was an international trade center. So, and I'm pretty sure he traveled to Egypt. So these kinds of cultural inputs would have been familiar to him. But
yeah, I wasn't arguing that Thales actually knew this story, just
right.
that water has a primacy.
Yes,
even today.
I agree with that. I agree with that.
Right, and that's, like I said, what we're looking for on Mars is some evidence of water.
Tony, I have a question.
Yes.
How did Thales defend himself against the oppositions to his theory about everything being made of water?
We don't know. It's what we know about these guys is just I know some of you did get that Kirk and Raven book, and if you look at that book, that's everything we know about those guys, and they actually quote the Greek, and it's really in the weeds, that book, but that's all we know. And so most of this stuff is just fragments that are quoted by other people that may have written 200 years later. That's our level of being able to confirm what they really thought. So we don't know is the answer. All we can do is say, it's very likely that it'd be very unlikely that they hadn't read Homer and Hesiod.
Yeah.
I think they probably were familiar with that at least. And as Peter said, but Peter, did I tell you, it's Peter, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I did get that book that you recommended.
Mhm.
And I read about 100 pages so far. And one of the things I remember I wanted to bring up is uh, the author said, or the authors said, that for the primitive mind, I think I can almost quote this, it was impossible to imagine an inanimate world. The world was animated. And one of the things that Thales said, I don't think I mentioned this, stupid me. Thales said that in addition to water, he's famous for saying, uh, everything is is full of gods. Everything is full of gods, and so that's also an animate idea of nature that was uh, common to the Greeks. As a matter of fact, let me tell you real quick. I really don't want to go on too long here and put everybody to sleep, but Aristotle, Aristotle's theory of gravity is very interesting because Newton wasn't for another couple of thousand years. And the idea that the world was all mechanical was still, Anaxagoras was kind of a guy who thought the world uh, was best understood through kind of mechanical laws, physical laws. And some people found that objectionable because the world was alive. And so Aristotle's theory of gravity was that everything is trying to get where it belongs. And so the reason a rock falls down is because the rock's correct place, according to Moira or Logos or Ananke or whatever your word for the justice and the correct order of the universe, a rock is supposed to live down at the bottom on Earth. Air is supposed to live above the Earth. And if you blow bubbles, if you're underwater and you blow bubbles, they will rise. Because why? Because air is trying to get where it belongs. And fire also burns up. Why does fire do that? Because it's trying to get to the sky where it belongs, like the sun and the stars. So it's an animated view of the laws of physics, and that's from Aristotle, who's kind of a hardhead, with regard to these things. But he too shared this idea that the world was alive, and I think it's hard to say, but I think that was a common Greek belief that everything was, like your author said, Peter, the primitive mind. I don't like the word primitive, but whatever. The ancient mind had a hard time imagining the world not being alive. Put it that way.
80 years ago, everybody said primitive in relation.
Yeah, I know. It's the only reason I object to it is because they weren't that dumb. Primitive kind of implies others stupid, and I've always been impressed with how smart they were. I mean, there's a lot of things that people figured out back then that were very clever. And these are some of the guys. But it's not just intellectual things. They also figured out, how to make arrowheads, how to tie knots, a lot of stuff that's been lost, the inventors of which have been long lost to history. But those are very clever things that they did. Anyway, any more questions or comments or arguments or insults? No? All right. Well, we'll meet again.
Something?
I'm sorry?
Tony,
Yeah.
can I say something?
Well,
I just
certainly.
read a review of a new book making some theories about bones found in a pit with bones of many other animals and birds from hundreds of thousands of years ago. And bones of people were there. And the theory that this one fellow has come up with was that our morality and our view of ourselves was founded in fear because we we were a prey animal in the beginning. We were definitely not the top of the heap, and his theory about that particular pit was that every all the bones that you found there belonged to animals that were eaten by a giant bird, he thought probably. And as a result, since our troglodytic selves were operating out of fear, that sticks with us. And that fear remains our animating feeling. Not fairness, not justice, not wisdom, not anything, not love, but fear. And as a result, we're easy to scare. And those of us who are scared of Trump, we're operating out of initial fear, the fear that has been our animating feeling since the beginning.
Well, there's a lot to unpack there, and we'll get to some of that stuff. Hobbes had a similar view. I don't happen to agree that that is the primary source of our motivation. I think it's certainly, well, obviously, it's one of them. And it's the reason why social media tends to attract more viewers if they can create some kind of fear. You know, if something's scary, you're going to pay attention, and there's an evolutionary reason for that, no doubt. You know, in other words, if you make an error and misjudge something that is scary and don't think it's scary, it's better to make an error on the side of being scared of things you shouldn't be scared of than not being scared of things that you should be scared of, if that makes sense. So there's a
Yes.
more of a threat to you if you don't see a threat when you should, than if you do see a threat when you shouldn't. That's okay, because that's not going to kill you. But if you don't see the threat, it is going to kill you. So there's no doubt that fear is a motivating factor. I think when we get to Hobbes is going to base his whole philosophy on that, more or less. And I have a criticism of that. We'll get to at the when we get there. But in a nutshell, human beings are social animals, and our livelihood depends as much on being part of a group as it does on defending our own personal safety. And so our personal safety, even if you say that fear is the main thing, depends on us being congenial and collegial with other human beings. In primitive societies, getting ostracized was a death penalty. You were not going to survive as a lone human being. And our primate relatives, bonobos and chimpanzees, are the closest, are social animals with intricate social bonds. And the only of the other great apes that isn't like that is an orangutan, and they live solitary lives. But I think it's definitely part of our primitive nature to be caring, and we wouldn't survive without that. Big ideas. Anybody else want to chip in?
I was just going to say that, yeah, the brain's negative bias is something that is very prevalent in neuropsychology, and the fact that you can overcome that with positivity and connection is one way to do that. I like how you tied that together.
Yeah, I mean, it is clear that we are social animals and we need each other. And in order to be accepted as social animals, we have to have certain interpersonal skills. You can't be a jerk and expect to be protected by everybody else. It's the golden rule, but it's kind of a evolutionary reason for a golden rule, which is as good as any other reason.
I was interested, Tony, in your talking originally about Thales and the idea of proofs, and the idea that there's a way of laying out an argument logically, because I think that has a lot to do with how people write and explain things, that having been exposed to that process, even if you're, not a trained mathematician or something. But I noticed it watching the evolution of writing in our grandson, who had a math courses starting very early where they had to write proofs, and they were graded for style as well as accuracy, and it translated to writing. And I think I'll be curious to see if you think that knowing mathematics or having that influence culturally had an impact on later philosophers when they tried to lay out arguments and counter each other. That, are they looking for flaws in how your assumptions are set up or your logical flow? Because I think that's certainly something that some of our current people in public life have no concept of how to make a cogent argument or how to counter things. So, I'm wondering if that will show up again, the idea that there's a way of thinking and explaining things that, step by step, state your assumptions, the kind of proofy world.
I would say it's a core thing in philosophy. Yeah. Like I say, nobody gets respect even from their students. They have to defend themselves. And so that's one thing. Plato on the, supposedly, we can't verify it, but supposedly on the entrance to the academy, Plato's school, it said no one who is ignorant of geometry should enter this this school. And so Plato, and we'll get to this, but he considered it absolutely central to your intellect to understand math. And
not because you need to know trigonometry or whatever, but it's a way of thinking.
Right.
It's a process.
Mr. Math?
Right. And then, of course, Aristotle will be responsible. Aristotle's the guy that developed the first rules of logic and the syllogism, and we'll get to that. Plato wasn't, there's no formal logic in Plato. The logic is what he calls dialectic. We're going to get to all this stuff, but dialectic, his way of talking about it is the process of collection and division. Somebody just said goodbye. Process of collection and division, and Aristotle refined it in the syllogism, which we'll get to. But he was the father of logic, and yeah, it's very important, and it stays important until about the 19th century. And it's still important, but there were other kind of fashions that came around in the 19th century that somewhat, in some cases, diminished the power of logic. But I think that's a fantasy. They thought they did diminish the power of logic, but I don't think that happened.
Well, I think there's always, stating your assumptions and the fact that there are things you can't actually prove.
Yeah.
We'll get to all that, but I was just, because I was really interested to think about this person.
I can barely hear you, Laurel, by the way. I don't know. Okay. I don't know how to fix that, but
I do, but I'll worry about it later. But yeah, it's a cool beginning. Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else?
Okay. I just say I very appreciate the way you're presenting these ideas as layers. I mean, we really learn almost any complex field of knowledge that way, but sort of seeing how these build and where do pieces of how we think and see the world come into the picture. I like that approach.
Yeah, I do too. And when I started studying philosophy, this is not how it's normally presented, or at least it wasn't presented to me this way. And I'm just going, what is going on here? And I'd say that was true for my first 3 or 4 philosophy classes. because it was never put in context like this for me, even though that's how textbooks read. I probably because I didn't take introductory philosophy at Pomona College. That's probably why there was a problem.
Well, thank you very much, Tony.
Yeah. Okay,
Thanks,
everybody. I will, as always, is there anybody here that I don't have an email for? Okay, so I will again post artificial intelligence takes notes on all this, as I said, and I will send that out to you. And you have to take it with a grain of salt, but it's much better than what I say is it's much better than most of my students would do. And then I'll post this video so that whenever you miss one, you can just tune in, but you just won't be able to talk back. Okay, so next time on Thursday, it'll be Heraclitus, Parmenides, and Pythagoras. So we'll see you then.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.